around the world. O'Neill, who brought in some limited reforms on housing, basically resigns in 1968. There's a whole series of sectarian riots that follow that. And critically, what you have at the same time is the formation of paramilitary organizations. Okay, so the civil rights movement now radicalizes and takes military form. So you have the Irish Republican Army, the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1966, and the Ulster Defence Association in 1971. That made Britain basically the home of radical terrorist networks in Europe at that point. Of course, in Spain you had the ETA movement for Basque separation, you had the Red Brigade in Italy, you had the Baader-Meinhof in Germany. But actually, Northern Ireland was the most, was the terrorist central in Europe in the late 1960s. And that was sort of surprising because in the 1950s, the IRA had become sort of redundant. Indeed, in the 1950s, the Irish Republican Army had sold its arms to the Free Wales Army. And I'm not talking about the mammals, I'm talking about the country. Okay, so the IRA had basically given up in the 1950s, and indeed, in the murals in Belfast, there were signs saying IRA equals I ran away. Many people in Belfast, many Catholics in Belfast had felt deserted by the IRA. But in the fracture of the civil rights movement and the repression of it, they gathered steam again and took heart from the growing repression of the civil rights movement, which culminated in the imposition of internment in 1971 and the infamous Bloody Sunday massacre in January 1972, when paratroopers killed 13 people on the civil rights march. That leaves the Conservative Prime Minister, Edward Heath, to impose direct rule upon Northern Ireland. Okay, so Northern Ireland becomes basically under direct colonial rule and is occupied by the British Union. Now the Unionists, the Ulster Unionists, the Protestants in Northern Ireland, felt that this was necessary to defend the Union. The Irish Catholics felt, well, this is a fine example of colonial occupation. By 1973-1974, there were attempts by the British government to try and broker a new type of power-sharing arrangement that would try to bring some level of Catholic involvement in the administration of Northern Ireland, first through a new assembly and then through the so-called Sunningdale Agreement that set up a variety of mechanisms to bring Catholics into the governing process. And there's a great summary of all this on the website from last week's reading if you want to go over this ground, which I'm going through very, very quickly. That collapses because the Ulster Unionists campaign against it. They see this as Britain abandoning Northern Ireland to the Catholics and to their agenda to try and unify the island of Ireland. Enoch Powell, our friend, then stands for election as an Ulster Unionist in the 1974 election in defence of the Union. So having argued against immigration, now he's defending the integrity of the United Kingdom. In 1974, the Ulster Unionist Party gets a good deal of votes, and the whole process of trying to set up a new assembly collapses, and direct rule is imposed again and lasts for something like another 25 years. The last point that I want to make about Northern Ireland is that Mrs. Thatcher makes the management of the so-called Northern Ireland problem a central part of her politics. That she was not going to back down. She was not going to negotiate with terrorists. And the best example of that was her determination not to compromise to the hunger strikes in 1981 that led to the death of a whole series of Irish Republican of IRA members, including the leader of the protest, Bobby Sands. And there's a very haunting movie called Hunger that came out about 18 months ago. If you want to watch that, cinematically, it's one of the most breathtaking movies. Okay, very quickly on to the process of devolution. What you're getting here is that the United Kingdom, the Union of the United Kingdom, is becoming increasingly under pressure. Okay, and that was true in Scotland and Wales just as much as in Ireland. Not that the Scottish and the Welsh had anything like the type of militarised nationalist movement as you had in Northern Ireland. The Free Wales Army was about 3 people and a couple of sheep. I'm no doubt going to get a Welsh nationalist right into me now. It was a very significant movement. Welsh and Scottish nationalism basically emerges in the late 19th century with the great revival of Celtic and Gaelic culture. Okay? It takes political shape in the 1920s and 1930s in the form of Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalist political party, and the Scottish National Party. Okay? Their great push in Wales was for equal recognition of the Welsh language. Okay? And that was granted in 1967 so that every road sign in Wales is bilingual. You have the English name for it and you have the Welsh name. More importantly, politically, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, these political parties are beginning to get a foothold into the political process, specifically or importantly at the local government level, but also increasingly in by-elections. You know, when an MP resigns or dies or whatever, and they hold a special vote. They become politically even more significant because the Labour government that gets in 1974, gets in twice in 1974, is a minority government, becomes a minority government and becomes dependent upon the support of the Welsh and Scottish nationalist members. And so they promise in return for their support to hold a devolution referendum in 1979. But that referendum leads to a defeat. In Wales, they only get about 25% of the vote. In Scotland, they just get 33% of the vote, 7% short of the required 40%. That defeat of the referendum led to the Scottish and the Welsh nationalist parties withdrawing their support from Labour. There was a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons, and that triggered the election in 1979. So in actual fact, this process of devolution was critical to the final collapse of the Labour Party in the late 1970s. So I don't have time to stop for any questions because this next section is going to be a biggie. And maybe when we get to punk, I can breathe. Okay. Now the point of this section is basically going to be able to say to you, look, what I'm going to describe as neoliberal economics, that is the idea that the economy works best when the market is liberalized and made free, was not something that just arrived in the 1980s with Reagan and with Thatcher. That actually there was a much earlier movement of this, both intellectually and, as you're about to see, politically. So intellectually, the key genealogy basically starts with the influence of Friedrich Hayek and the LSE in the 1940s. Okay? Now, this remains basically a fringe concern, but Enoch Powell, our old friend, in the 1960s begins to pick up on some of this type of work and of thinking. And it's Powell who begins to talk about the necessity of liberalizing and deregulating the economy through the exchange rates and particularly through through labour markets, and begins to outline what a sort of monetarist economic set of policies would look like. This agenda, okay, which Powell in a way deserts because he gets tied up with the national question in the late 60s and 70s, is picked up by this man sitting next to Margaret Thatcher, Sir Keith Joseph. No, he's not just at this point, he was just a regular Keith, actually. He didn't become Sir, obviously, until much later. And he sets up the Centre for Policy Studies in 1974 as the think tank that was going to provide the policies that would launch a revival of the Conservative Party and a sweeping away of social democracy. Now, this wasn't just going on in the UK, of course. This was happening in the US as well. And it was a sort of international phenomenon. In some ways, that's nicely made apparent by the fact that Hayek and Milton Friedman get the Nobel Prize for Economics in 74 and in 76, respectively. But the man actually leading the Conservative Party was the only Prime Minister I've ever met, Edward Heath, Ted Heath. Okay, and Ted Heath is important not just because he was the first Conservative leader of the Conservative Party who was not an aristocrat, he was just a regular sort of middle-class boy, but because arguably it was him that set about the project of so-called economic modernisation of the British economy, namely the project of liberalising the economy. So he introduces a whole series of reforms. Decimalisation, which was the abandonment of the old shillings system, and the pence, a decimal system of money, which was totally traumatic as a kid. I was 6 years old. I used to get my pocket money, walk up to the stores to buy my candies, and suddenly I had a different set of money that I didn't know what it amounted to. But I recovered and was still able to buy my Mars bars. So decimalisation, Industrial Relations Act, trying to reduce the power of the trade union movement in 1971, local government reform in 1972. It's Heath that leads the UK into the European Economic Community in 1973. It's Heath that scraps the regional development agencies and the support of supposedly lame duck nationalised industries. And it's Heath who presides over the floating of the pound with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the sterling area. So a whole series of policies, an attack on the labour movement, the liberalisation of the removal of public support for nationalised industries, and a support of a floating currency system. All of things that are going to be very important later on. However, politically they're a disaster, and by 1974 inflation